So this is the presentation that you give to the 5 people who come back to lunch on time, from lunch on time. I'm clicking, it's waiting. There you go. PowerPoint. You cannot imagine a more boring talk title than this, but I promise it won't be excruciatingly dull. It'll maybe be like a sharp stick, not a dull stick in your eye. So therefore, of course, we start off with why care about metrics. This is actually a pretty important topic, and yet it feels so naturally dull to all of us. So I'm going to try to spend just a couple minutes convincing you that this actually matters. If at that point I fail and there's coffee outside, you could get some and come back and try again. So the first thing we care about is that transient withdrawals and flapping of routes, which is what we're going to talk about metrics for, actually matter to your networks regardless of whether you cause them or not. So we're talking about metrics for routing instabilities and transient unreachable networks in the interdomain space. But they affect your routing tables, they affect the reachability of those routes from your networks, they affect your users. So they matter regardless of whether you cause them or not. So that's the first thing I want you to believe. I don't know whether you believe it yet, but I want you to believe it. And the second thing I want you to believe is that we need a way of quantifying the scope and magnitude of these problems. And frankly, what I mean by that is we need a way of quantifying and qualifying suckitude. Right now, we all say, oh, such and such sucks, or yesterday so-and-so sucked, or that other thing, it really sucked a lot. Yeah, we suck less than those guys suck. So what we're here to tell you is, actually we can give some numbers to and some characteristics of the ways in which different kinds of things suck, and we can use that to compare various kinds of suckitude. And so you can say things like, although it got a whole lot of press, the DOS against SCO in fact didn't suck at all. It just didn't matter. It didn't score on the suck meter of any sort. Whereas other kinds of things that got much less press, in fact, sucked a lot. And we'll tell you the ways in which they sucked. So think of point number 2 as quantifying and qualifying suckitude. I didn't think that would get through on the slide, so it sounds more formal here. Do you like that? The third one I want to talk about is a common language. Right now, and this is really essentially the same thing, right now we need a way of exchanging information about how bad things are and the way in which they're bad. And then the fourth is just the standard sort of MBA mantra that turns out to be annoyingly true even though the MBAs talk about it all the time, which is you really actually can't improve stuff you don't measure, because it turns out you just do random stuff and sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse and it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, and I'm going to go pretty fast because there's a lot of content, we're going to introduce some fast changing routing metrics for misbehaving prefixes. We're going to talk about 2 concrete metrics. One of them is nets out and one of them is penalty boxes. I'm going to talk about how to calculate those metrics, how you can calculate those net metrics, and show just a couple examples of the different kinds of things those metrics catch. And then we'll show how to compute them on data that you may already have, or how to compute them on ripe data or route views data that's available. Okay, so there's basically 2 kinds of routing metrics. One of them, there have been a lot of talks at NANOG about, a lot of you are well aware of the work on, which is structural metrics. Metrics about how many ASs there are and how those ASs relate to each other, and how many pairwise relationships there are and the degree of random ASs. And those are structural metrics. They're very slow moving, so they have to do with the structure of the way metrics work. That's not what we're talking about. Those are good metrics. A lot of smart people have done a lot of excellent work on that, and you should refer to that work. We're talking about fast metrics, so metrics that happen on the order of seconds to minutes to hours, that things change very dynamically very quickly. And so this you cannot do from very simple things like just looking at the rate of updates or looking at AS adjacencies. You have to look at individual routing updates. You have to look at every announcement and every withdrawal in order to be able to see these. So simple routing table metrics like dumping a table every 30 seconds, you miss it. It doesn't count. You have to look at every update. Okay, so an ideal instability, if we were to sit here and say an ideal instability metric wouldn't exist because it's kind of boring for you guys, but an ideal interesting instability metric would be something that was as applicable to the whole internet as it was to a single prefix or the whole collection of prefixes in an AS. It should be meaningful across multiple timescales. We should be able to tune it so that it's sensitive to the kinds of things we want, and I'll show you some basic tunings for this. And it should be easy to understand and compute. My claim is that we've done that. You can throw the fruit later if that turns out to not be true. Okay, so nets out. Two instability metrics we're proposing. Nets out counts the subpopulation of transiently withdrawn network prefixes at any given time. Transiently withdrawn means they didn't go away for forever, they did used to exist, they don't exist right now. There is no route for these prefixes right now. So when a big US government AS re-engineers their networks from 1450 prefixes to 43 prefixes, and the 1400 and change never come back, that's not transiently withdrawn. They were engineered out, they're never coming back, they don't count. But if something goes away, like let's say there's a big power outage in the northeast of the US, it wouldn't happen, but if it did happen, there might be 4 and change thousand prefixes that go away for up to 4 or 5 days, and then they all come back. That's transiently withdrawn. The other one we're talking about is penalty boxes. So we're going to count the subpopulation of network prefixes that are in various flat penalty states instantaneously. Okay, now just to clarify for those of you who are geeks about this, i.e. most of you, this doesn't mean that the networks that we're measuring actually turn on flat penalties, okay? So what this means is that we're using that as a metric of understanding how bad, of scoring the stability of routes. So I understand most networks, many networks don't turn on flap dampening, but using the flap dampening algorithms is still a very useful way of understanding how stable a route is. So, guidelines, you need if you were doing this for yourself, here's what you should do. You got to have a lot of peers, and they've got to be distinct. They've got to have different kinds of connectivity. They probably should be geographically dispersed, so you want them on most continents or all continents as we do. When you're trying to correlate announcements across peers, we all know, I mean, none of us would do this, but there are goofy people out there and they do silly things. And when one AS out there says that your prefix isn't reachable, it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, maybe if it's AOL it matters, or maybe if it's someone that you care about a lot, some trading partner, someone you have VPNs with for important customers, it matters. But on the whole, what any individual AS or any individual peer says probably doesn't matter that much. On the other hand, if 7 geographically dispersed peers all agree that a particular prefix is not reachable, that's significant. If they all have different upstreams and they all agree, that's very significant. Okay, so you have to correlate peer consensus, and you have to do temporal correlations. So as announcements cascade, you have to be able to say, this is a withdrawal, and if 2.5 minutes later a different peer withdraws the same prefix, it's part of the same withdrawal. It's part of the same prefix becoming unreachable. So you need a window of time in which you allow these things to stretch. And you have to factor out this temporal jitter. Different peers are going to see the same announcement at slightly different times, related to the update clocks, related to where they hear it from. So you have to factor that out. So here's a good example of this. Okay, in this chart, each one of these is a peer of ours. We've got peers on every continent except for Antarctica, and I'll pay someone money to give me a full table from Antarctica. I'm just announcing that right now. Anybody, I don't know, $100? You got a full table from Antarctica? Okay. All right. He just said $100? I don't know. You got a full table from Antarctica? We'll talk later. Each one of these is a peer. Okay, green are announcements, red are withdrawals. And here you see this whole block in the middle. These peers are flapping something fierce, okay? This is a single /24 over 12 hours, and you've got all these peers behaving in this particular way, and these two right here are behaving in the same way, all right, up here. But then now you've got all these other peers at the top and at the bottom that in fact don't see that rate of announcements. And then you have other peers right there that are flap dampening, okay? So what this tells you is having 2 peers, having 5 peers probably isn't enough. You really need to correlate these kinds of things across a number of peers. Okay? There are reasons for that. The one that we were just looking at is this /24, and you can look at it in the slides, that comes from, and not to pick on them, but, well, it's their /24, O1 Communications. There's a number of their upstreams are only seeing the /17. So those people think that this is a very stable route. This is very reachable. There's a whole collection of other people who get the route via Cogent that, in fact, are seeing all kinds of instability on the /24. Okay? Again, looking at the way various peers see this stuff, you see a bunch of instability there on the left-hand side. A rapid succession of announcements, withdrawals, announcements. Okay, so something happened. Then you see the silent period. So a bunch of people decided, this is a waste of time, I'm not listening to this, I'm going to dampen this. Eventually the announcements come back. So there's a collection of peers who see the announcements earlier. Then pretty much everyone says, okay, I see these announcements later. There's a number of outliers here. There's 2 peers who see it much, much later, and there's 1 peer of ours who never reannounces that route in the 30-day time window that we saw. So again, the point here is, this stuff looks pretty easy. If you look at the route dynamics from a single peer or a very small number of peers, it is tempting to think it's very easy to correlate this stuff. In fact, what happens when you look at a larger number of peers is the temporal correlation and the differences in policy end up making it very difficult to correlate when a route is flap dampened, when a route is actually reachable by a number of peers. The second part of the guideline for fast metric design is you want to discount outages that are reported by a very few peers. You want to enhance outages that are reported by a large number of peers. This is stuff I was talking to you about before. You want to provide some knobs to turn so that you can set the maximum outages and the minimum outages, the maximum number of flaps that you care about, the minimum number. And here's the key thing I think for the operational community. What we do at Renesys is we do internet-wide stuff. We correlate this stuff on the internet-wide. But ultimately it becomes useful when you look at subpopulations. These are either subpopulations of prefixes that come from a single AS or subpopulations of prefixes that come from a single geographical location or are related to a single fiber cut. So you want to be sure that you can hone in your metrics to focus on a set of prefixes that has some meaning outside of the full internet, because the full internet roughly has the stability it has and the prefixes have the stability they have, and it probably doesn't change that much over time. All right, so I'm going to describe these metrics. There's math, but it's very little math. It's just very simple. Nets out is the number of globally routable prefixes at time t that are suffering an outage. An outage begins when at least some number of peers, 3, 5, 10, it depends on how many peers you have, but at least some number of peers have seen withdrawals. Those withdrawals are separated by no more than some number of seconds. So, if I see 2 withdrawals and then 20 minutes later I see 2 other withdrawals, that's not part of the same unreachability. It probably doesn't make sense. Whereas if I see 2 withdrawals and then 30 seconds later I see 3 more withdrawals, that's part of the same cascaded withdrawal, okay? And then it ends when no more than the same number of peers continue to believe that the prefix is withdrawn. One of the key things here is the maximum. Again, minimum and maximum. We suggest for minimum 120 seconds is a pretty good number. Maximum right now 7 days. The longer you go, the harder this is to calculate. Some prefixes never come back, and that's okay. If it's a result of re-engineering, if it's a result of readdressing, if the prefix goes away and it never comes back, you just need to not count that as an outage. Okay? Show some examples of what this looks like and the sensitivity of the knobs to various kinds of adjustments. Peer withdrawal jitter. So the peer withdrawal jitter, it's not very sensitive. Basically, you see the same shape on the top, whether you set it on 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Mostly withdrawals happen within a relatively short period of time. You don't have to wait 10 minutes for a withdrawal from all of your peers to show up. So that's good, because waiting around for these things is computationally expensive. You have to store a lot of state to do that. Correlating it by number of peers is somewhat sensitive. It turns out with 3 peers, and this is good news for people who want to do these kinds of metrics for themselves, with 3 peers, you can get pretty good numbers. With 30 peers, you get a lot better numbers. With 50 peers, you probably just have enough peers and you see most things. So somewhere in there, but 3, you'll see that the shape of 3 is pretty close to the shape of 30, that the outages that a peer 3 sees is pretty close to the outages that you see with 30. And then finally, one that is very sensitive is how long are you going to let an outage go on before you stop calling it an outage and think of it as something else? This is just a policy question. I think something that's down for 7 days is probably not an outage. It's probably something else. 0.5 to 6 days, somewhere around 6 or 7 days seems to be, beyond that, maybe it doesn't make sense to call it an outage. Here's an example of what you can see easily with the nets out measurement. You see the iOS upgrades. They show up as a few set of spikes, in the late summer, or I guess midsummer if you're from somewhere other than New Hampshire. And then the California, or the US and the Canada blackout in the northeastern US and in southeastern Canada, that shows up. A lot of prefixes went out. That's the kind of thing that this metric shows. Okay? Distribution of outage durations, you can see a sharp drop off at 24 hours. So you can see that some significant number of outages drops off after 24 hours. Other than that, it looks like it looks exponential curve. It looks like outages distribute and decline exponentially over some reasonable amount of time. So there's interesting work to be done in why this looks this way. Second metric is penalty boxes. This is how many prefixes are in various kinds of flap dampening penalty states. This is the standard flap dampening algorithms. There's choices of different algorithms, and there's some good research to be done on which one is correct. So basically, you put a prefix in a penalty state. When either a withdrawal or announcement is reached, you decay that exponentially. If it's and then you count the number of prefixes that are in various boxes. Very simple. You see here some of the things that you can adjust with that. If you look at the number of prefixes in penalty 4, 6, and 8 here, you'll see that the August 14th blackout in the US and Canada does not show up on this metric, which is cool. That means that this metric captures something different from the nets out metric. This captures routing that is for prefixes that changes rapidly, and that wasn't a big change. 4,000 odd prefixes went away. Many, many hours later, some of them started to come back. After that, they were all back. That's not big changes. On the other hand, the so big worm is a big spike here. That means that the so big worm caused a lot of routing changes on a lot of people's networks over a relatively short period of time. So the point, the take-home message here is you can make pretty pictures to show that this captures something different than the other one. All right, an interesting 3D view on penalty boxes. There is one long flapping autonomous system, had about 40 odd prefixes in, and you can see the blue, and basically all of its prefixes were in zero penalty state. All of a sudden, roughly on September 20th, a bunch of prefixes started flapping really, really heavily, all the way up into 15 penalty, which means that we either saw an announcement or a withdrawal up to 15 times every 10 minutes for those prefixes. So this is a lot of routing activity over a large number of days. So this wasn't a few hours, this wasn't a weekend, this wasn't a week, this is a few weeks. And then they all got better all of a sudden. And you can think what you will about that. So let me wrap up. Why bother with this? I tried to make a compelling case, but there are long-term problems with the kinds of situations that these metrics measure that people in this community don't spend a lot of time talking or thinking about. So well-respected ASs will flap significant numbers of routes for relatively long periods of time, undetected. And nobody cares about it. Or maybe once they know about it, they care about it. But we don't measure these things and we don't talk about their impact. We don't have good standards for when your boss tells you, oh, the SCO worm, it's a big deal, we got to do something about it. It'd be nice to have a metric that says, actually, you know what, the SCO worm's not doing anything. It's not important. It doesn't matter that much. We need to know how far these excursions from the norm go and how long they go on for. So we've presented some simple intuitive metrics here. They work over short and long periods of time. They work across the whole internet or just your prefixes or just a set of prefixes that you care about. They're sensitive to various kinds of tuning, so you can tune them in ways that show you the kinds of features you're interested in. They can help us automatically distinguish between bad stuff and good stuff. And these are things that you can compute by yourself. You can get ripe data, you can get route views data, and we'd be happy to accept your BGP feeds and help compute these things for you. So thank you very much.
Our next presenter is not yet here. So while he comes up to get himself ready, Avi, you've got 3 seconds.
In an operational sense, you have to quantify the impact of the churn. I think a lot of sense that right. Okay. A lot of us get the sense that there is impact, performance impact to sequences of high churn, but I think that isn't really accepted, something people could point to. Second thing is, it would be interesting to look at the taxonomy of updates. Some updates change paths, some don't. Withdrawals versus updates, and have.
Wait, do I have time to comment on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a small technical problem, so.
Okay. The first point, yeah, I don't know how to quantify the operational impact of these. Just some raw numbers. On the AS that we pointed to in that graph, over about 30 odd peers, which is what we measured it on, we had about 400,000 announcements or withdrawals in 24 hours for like 12 prefixes. So it's not a tiny amount of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. But I don't know how much that matters.
It's sort of a loaded question. The RON project people have done some studies. We've done some studies that show correlation between actual user performance and churn. But I think that a lot of people don't realize that there's sort of proof of that, and in fact, not much research has been done on that. But to get the boss to realize that it is or isn't a problem, he's not going to know from, high BGP churn. He's going to want to know, what does that mean, impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Avi.